Good. Can you hear me? Okay, good. GMOs, genetically modified organisms. You know, I mean, you hear a lot about this, you know, at how they're not good, they're toxic and everything else. Well, there's a different effect to it, okay, that most is missed by a lot of people. Its effect on the soil. Now, anybody in here remember the Dust Bowl? Or was that just like half a page inside of your history books? Just like half a page, okay? It was the largest man-made disaster the world had ever seen. And we're going to cover that because there was dust storms so great that it would blot out the sun at noon. Thousands and thousands of people were dying from this pneumonia from this dust. But the dust back in the 30s was not anything like the dust we had now. And when we're looking at this, we're talking about genetically modified farming practices in this area called the Great American Desert. Now, what's interesting, these are quotes from the time back when, see, we bought this section of land from France, got it at a good deal, called the Louisiana Purchase, and so we sent some people out there to explore it to see what was worth it. And this was their comments at the time. They called it the American Desert. It's unfit for farming. And it's true, because this area that's called the Dust Bowl, and it encompasses, you'll see Kansas and North Dakota and Colorado and New Mexico and part of Texas. It's unfit for farming because they can have droughts as long as 10 years. And so the Zebulon Pike, if you're an explorer, don't you want a name like Zebulon Pike? I mean, that just sounds cool. But he said these vast plains of the Western Hemisphere may become equally celebrated as the sandy deserts of Africa. They call it the Great American Desert. It's almost wholly unfit for cultivation and, of course, uninhabitable by people depending on agriculture for their substance. Now, this is where all the Great Plains were, where the millions and millions of buffaloes were. So people would see this game, and they thought that it was not arid, but that it was good. The problem is that there's no water, okay? And the plant that was there was buffalo grass, and it had roots 5 feet deep that would get water, you know, and could survive, but not the farming practices that we have. So what they did is the government decided to invest in this land, to take this buffalo grass land, okay, and manifest destiny. We're going to turn it into something profitable. Okay, and so what they did is when mechanized farming came around in the 20s and early 1900s, it was phenomenal. And so they tore up this buffalo grass that had been there for, you know, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years, that had adapted to the drought conditions and the high winds, and through mechanized farming and incredibly poor farming practices, where they would tear up the topsoil and plant, and they were hoping for rain. And they even felt that rain followed the plow, because there was areas that when the first railroad tracks came in there, that it was just deluging down, and they'd never seen rain that much before. And they had no crop rotation. See, farmers for thousands of years would take a crop and realize that if you have wheat, it's going to draw certain nutrients from the soil. And so you would change and do another wheat in another field, and then plant corn or millet or hemp or something, so that it would draw out different nutrients, so you're not totally depleting the nutrients in the soil. Okay, this type of practice has been going on for thousands of years. Well, they didn't do that because it was super profitable. So they just ripped up everything. Well, when the Depression hit in the '29, this was a boom era. They had more money than they knew what to do with. They would just kept on increasing and increasing. However, since the rest of the economy was faltering, they started in the mid-30s, or the 1933, 1934, when the drought was at one of its peaks. They didn't have the market for it. So they had these massive black blizzards. Now, these black blizzards were horrible. It would blot out the sun. But so I want you to picture that, and figure they overutilized the land, they ripped up the natural plants, They caused too much farming and monocrops, so it depleted the soils. And then when they couldn't have a market for that, they left the soil bare. So I mean, this is like bare soil with no plants on it to hold it together. And then this area is prone to winds of 60 and 70 miles an hour. They had black blizzards. Get this, I mean, this is in the middle of the country. In Washington, D.C., they said you couldn't see a yard in front of you. In New York City, they had to stop boats because the boats couldn't see the city because of the dust clouds. They had over 3 inches of dirt in Chicago from these dust clouds flowing over there. Now, and we're talking thousands of people dying from pneumonia from this dust. What if when this happens again, because I want you to look at those farming practices and think of that dust, think of the contents of that dust. Okay, so when we look at this, after the Dust Bowl, they needed to find some type of water. So they drilled down, and we're talking in some cases hundreds of feet. They found a massive ancient water storage area. It's called the Ogallala Aquifer. And we're talking just thousands and thousands and thousands of acres, okay, of water. Now, when you look at this, it seems like incredible, and it happens to be over the area. And this was ancient water. It's replenished about a ½ inch a year, and we take out about 30 inches a year. So, and you know what happens if you withdraw more than you deposit? You're running out. Okay. Well, the tough part. Some estimates say that this water is going to be gone in 5 years. Some people say 10 years. There's no estimate that I saw that was over 20 years. So within 20 years, it's completely gone. And that's at current consumption. But what's tough is the ½ inch a year that it's being replenished, they're replenishing it with a massively different type of water. See, the land isn't set up for farming. We're chemically altering it for farming. We're drawing water up. Now the soil is being depleted. And since the 70s, and we're going to talk about the Green Revolution, but the Green Revolution meant high-yield crops. Now remember, we've got certain parameters we have to live with. If you have a crop that is high yield, that grows fast and produces a lot, it's going to draw more nutrients out of the soil. It's going to require more water. Does that make sense? And so you can't grow it in a desert. Okay, and it's called the Great American Desert. Well, currently, the Ogallala Aquifer, we're starting to see pesticides in it, and these pesticides are going to retard fetal development. The wells contain nitrate levels, and nitrate is absolutely carcinogenic. We're looking at this, and it provides water, drinking water, to 82% of the population. When you look at this, this is a massive stretch. Oklahoma, New Mexico, Colorado, Kansas, 82% of the water comes from this Ogallala Aquifer that will be gone in 20 years. And currently it's poisonous. And this is the only thing that's holding the topsoil together. When we look at this, the Green Revolution, and this has been held as like incredible. You know, we finally were able to feed the world, everything's good. But what they did, they developed these high-yield crops. Now, these weren't modified genetically. They were just high-yield crops. The problem is the amount of money and fertilizer and water that it required. Remember, if they're getting high yields, they need more nutrients out of the soil. So chemical fertilizer went crazy. And then we're talking chemical pesticides as well. Because if you're doing a monocrop, and let's say that you have a certain type of fungus. That fungus may grow and kill some of the crop, but if you plant the exact same crop the next year, guess what? More fungus. Exact same crop the next year, more fungus. So if you rotate the crops to different types, where you're going to rotate barley with hemp with corn, you're going to allow for those diseases that are susceptible to that, or that plant, that the diseases won't flourish, because the soil has to be alive. And so it would work. The problem is, think back to the 30s. Large-scale production. Why? Because they're doing high-yield crops, mechanized farming. High-yield crops, so that's depleting the soil of nutrients, and it's also requiring a lot more water. Do we have limited water in our breadbasket? Yeah, it's, 5 years at the short end, 20 years at the high end. Short-term rotations, they're not rotating. Now, huge amount of chemical fertilizers, huge, okay, because we're drawing it up. Now, when we look at this, the Green Revolution, and this is in the 60s and 70s, and we're still kind of holding that. There's very little emphasis on natural farming practices. It was mainly based on chemical fertilizer. And I mean, I was born in the 1960s, so I remember this stuff. You know, oh man, the chemical fertilizers, you know, we're going to feed the world and all this other stuff. Well, kind of yes and kind of no. They abandoned the normal biologic, and these are studies now that they're saying these type of farming practices are dangerous. And these are studies done over 20 years ago. Severe diseases, insects and weed, nitrogen, carbon contents are going down in the soil. Changes in the soil, changes in the microbial community inside of the soil. So this is an incredibly dangerous practice. Now, luckily, this can be stopped. Okay, so now I'm not talking genetically modified foods. We're not talking any GMO stuff. We're talking toxic products of high-yield crops in areas that can't tolerate it. Okay, if we're living in the Nile Valley, where every year the Nile floods and it deposits that nutrient-rich silt down there, well, you can grow high-yield crops there because every year it gets all replaced. Does that make sense? You can't grow this stuff in a desert. And this one, Dr. Don Huber, he's a brilliant guy. I mean, when it comes to soil and soil contents, Professor Emeritus. Historians, here's his quote from him, historians may look back and write about how willing we are to sacrifice our children and jeopardize future generations with a massive experiment that's based on false promises and flawed science, just to benefit the bottom line of a commercial enterprise. Now he's talking about the farming practices and genetically modified organisms. What we're finding is one of the main features when you look at a GMO seed. See, the way farming practices have been, we have a male plant and a female plant. We join them and we see the offspring. We can join the offspring of those and then we can build the green apple, or we can build the yellow rose, or we can build whatever we want by taking the features out of it. So that's a linear progression of the DNA sampling, okay? In order to, we're taking interspecies DNA, using bacteria or viruses and injecting it into a seed, okay, or a plant. And we're expecting to do the same type of thing, but it doesn't work that way. And so what we're doing is the main modification is, think of this, it's a seed produced by a chemical company. Its main purpose is to sell more chemicals. Its main purpose is to withstand Roundup Ready or glyphosates, okay, and this is the #1 toxin. So it's a chemical seed produced by a chemical company in order to sell more chemicals. That's it. That's its sole purpose. And when we look at this, we're starting to find glyphosates in breast milk, okay, of America's moms. So that means it's crossed the food chain. It's being eaten by the animals and we're getting it. And for some reason, spraying this massive amount of pesticides over, because remember, we've got the monocrops. The monocrops are predisposed to disease unless we kill everything. And now we're getting super weeds because, you know, plants are smart. They're going to adapt to this. Glyphosates found in America is urine and drinking water. It's 10 times higher than Europe. Why would it be 10 times higher in Europe? Because they're moving away from the genetically modified stuff. And he's not a depressed guy. This guy is just accurate. Glyphosate's many times more toxic than DDT, a mineral chelator. It means it's drawing minerals out. Remember, if you're mineral deficient, you can't utilize your vitamins. I mean, what's one of the supplements that we recommend? Minerals, okay, because we know we're exposed to it. Patented antibiotic, which means it kills healthy bacteria. That means the soil is now dying because you need bacteria, you need funguses, you need life in that soil in order to allow the plants to break down the nutrients. And when we look at this, his quote here, we've pretty much sacrificed an entire generation of children. We no longer go, the longer we go, the more damage is going to accumulate. This is one website that I really recommend, foodintegritynow.org. They're brilliant, okay? But now this is, I want you to understand about the genetically modified food. It's a chemical seed solely designed to sell more chemicals. Those chemicals are sprayed on plants. Only 10% of the chemical gets attached to the plant. 90% of it hits the ground and hits the groundwater. And we're talking a massive increase in this. Now, when they use these genetically modified seeds in other countries, such as India or Africa, what they're advertising, they're saying this is an incredibly high yield plant. You're going to make a ton of money. Here's the problem. Remember, it's a high yield plant. So it needs to draw what out of the soil? Nutrients. If you don't have the nutrients in the soil, it's not going to be high yield. It needs a tremendous amount of water to produce more. So what do the farmers have to do once they buy that genetically modified seed? They got to get a huge amount of inorganic fertilizers. And then, if they're dependent on rainwater, what if they don't have enough rain? They're not going to get the high yield. So they've already been out of pocket for the fertilizer, out of pocket for the seeds, and they're not going to get the high yields. So it's really devastating a lot of the farming cultures in the planet. But now, it's like, that's bad enough. But don't buy yet, shoppers. Okay, the seeds were tested for no more than 90 days. If you test them for about 2 years, they cause tumor growth. These are all tumors from it. Now, 90% of it's in our water and soil. If it causes tumors in rats, do you think it's going to negatively affect human beings? What's also true is that the genetic modification, it affects the gut. And when you look at the studies, they're talking about GMOs are linked to autism. Yes, we know vaccines are, we know neurotoxins are, but these animals that are fed genetically modified foods are actually exhibiting the antisocial behavior, the fear factors, the jittery responses, okay, of autistic kids. But wait, are we feeding this to our population? Okay, good. So does it make sense that there'd be some emotional issues, neurologic damage, okay, intestinal tract? I was reading one study that said that if you're feeding genetically modified crops to farm animals, you know, they used to make sausage out of intestinal tract, okay? And some of them still do. It's called natural casings. You can't use an animal that's been fed genetically modified foods because the intestinal tract is destroyed. It has no integrity. So a lot of American sausage makers are having to get the intestinal tract so we can make sausage from other countries. Now, so this is not a benign process, and it's not stabilized. Now again, we're only talking about the pesticide aspect of a GMO stuff, okay? But when we look at this, now this is the only thing, studies on animals. It's called grass for human beings, generally recognized as safe. And that's about America. And if you have to prove that it's dangerous, okay, in Europe they don't approve it because it's not recognized as safe. We haven't proved it as dangerous. Do you see that? Yeah, I'm not a big fan of our Fraud and Deception Association. But infertility, accelerated aging. The biggest thing is protein formation, cholesterol synthesis. Because your body, if you're damaging proteins, then you are going to damage your body's ability to express itself. If you can control protein growth, you can cause cancer or reverse cancer. So anything that negatively affects protein growth, you're going to die. Okay, I mean, it's really serious. Now we're looking at tomatoes, canola, soy, corn, but papayas. I mean, everything. They had a big movement in Hawaii just a few weeks ago because you can't have a genetically modified papaya field on the same island as an organic papaya. It turns out pollen switches. And so now in Hawaii there's a huge, I mean, it's almost like a violent revolution where they're trying to get rid of all the genetically modified papayas so they can grow normal ones. And we're messing with stuff that we don't know. I mean, if we just talk about the Ogallala Aquifer and how these modified crops are utilizing way more water than what they should, it's going to turn it into a desert very quickly. Now, when we look at this, if the aquifer is going to be, let's say we take the largest estimate, 20 years. 20 years of water, it's gone. 84% of the population has no water. They're done. Okay, you can't live without water. Okay, we're just talking about the population. I'm not talking about the farming lands. Okay, now, it takes 2,400 gallons of water to produce 1 pound of meat. 2,400 gallons, okay? It takes 25 gallons to produce a pound of wheat. Okay, so we're talking 100 times, almost 100 times the amount of water needed to produce a pound of meat. So does that mean that we could extend the Ogallala Aquifer if we just grew plants by, oh, I don't know, what do you say, another 100 years? So instead of 20, it'd be almost a couple thousand? Would that be appropriate? Okay, good, just checking. I'm wondering if my math is good there. Okay, so when you look at this, 30% of the Earth's landmass is raised for animals, and I'm okay with eating an animal. It's fine, you know, but make sure it's a healthy animal. It just can't be a main staple of the diet. Currently, our government is paying so many subsidies to these it's called concentrated animal feeding operations, CAFOs, that if they weren't paying the subsidies, a burger would be 90 bucks. I mean, you'd be dressing in white tie and tails to go to McDonald's, although it's not healthy food. Okay, so now this is typical. So you can see that's an animal feeding operation. Now this happens to be located in that area where the Ogallala Aquifer. So for each pound of that cattle, it's going to cost us 2,400 gallons of water. And you start looking at this and you think, well, wait a second. That's horrific. 16 pounds of grain to produce 1 pound of meat. And you're thinking, so we're wiping out a generation. I mean, think of what were we going to tell our grandkids? And this is, you know, the way the Native Americans used to think, 7 generations down, any action they do, how is it going to affect their great-great-great-grandchildren? How is it going to affect our planet? So we wiped out the main source of water, turned the breadbasket of America into a desert to produce feed for hogs. I don't think that's appropriate. Okay, they can grow them somewhere else. Okay, so when we look at this, the CAFOs, they're having trouble with the toxic nature of their byproduct. This is where 70% of antibiotics are used. This is utilizing the genetically modified corn. You know, the grains produced by the genetic modification process are fed to these animals, making them sick, and then it's getting into the population. That's where we're seeing toxic components in the humans. Okay, so this has to stop. It just has to stop now. Now, how do genes work? And this is interesting because if you ask a geneticist how they work, they're going to say we're not quite sure. If you looked at it about 20 years ago, they developed a thing called the Human Genome Project. And this was, again, done by the chemical companies because well, when I was going back to school back in the late 80s, early 90s, there was a big stink out that the pharmaceutical companies were running out of sick people. Okay, and I know you're concerned because, if you run out of sick people, they're not going to be buying the product. So they developed this idea of the Human Genome Project where, you identify the gene that causes smoking, or you identify the gene that causes cancer, or you identify the gene that they thought that each gene produced a protein. So if you identify a gene of high cholesterol, you can produce a chemical to stop the production of that gene, and then you've saved that person a disease. Okay, so 20 years they invested billions of dollars to map out the human genome. Okay, except it turned out that even though the human body produces over 100,000 genes, we only have about, or 100,000 proteins, we only have about 24,000 genes. So now it's like, well, wait a second, I thought it was 1 gene per protein. No, it's not like that. Turns out we have a little bit more genes than a fruit fly, okay? And when you look at it, it even gets more complicated because when we look at this, only 2% of the DNA is coded for proteins. So 98% of that 24,000 genes isn't utilized for that. It's not utilized for protein production. So now all of this money, these billions of dollars in research to identify the genetic origin of disease, we find out that it's not genetics. It's genetic expression of the disease. And I love this, but research has, but as more research is done, we're beginning to learn more about the DNA between genes and intergenetic DNA. Now, turning it on and off. Now, when you look at this, genetically modified foods or organisms, they're taking a gene that they used to think was producing a protein. But now we know, and if you're just talking humans, only 2% produce a protein, 98% do something other. They have other interactions. So we're putting that artificially inside of a seed, of a plant. So it's supposed to carry some of those traits. And then this is supposed to not negatively affect human beings. It's completely different. They don't. So when Dr. Huber talks about false science, false premise, bad science, bad everything, he's actually right. They really don't know how this works. So you're snipping genes, using viruses to get them into the plant, and it's not known what it's going to do. I mean, human genes, if you compare humans, we only have about 24,000 genes. And I love this last one. It's called human interactome. So it's not a human genome. There's something to do with how the genes interact with the environment, with the stimulus to produce certain proteins. So we're just, I mean, it's kind of like fire, ready, aim. Okay. We're just going to inject it in the population and then kind of look and see what the heck happens. You know, so it's not appropriate. Understanding the human genome definitely does not go far enough to explain what makes us different from more simple creatures. Our study indicates that protein interactions can hold one of the keys to unraveling how one organism is differentiated from another. And when you look at this was 2008. This is like recent stuff. And genetically modified organisms have been in our food supply since like 1998. And it's getting crazy. I mean, even when you look at so we're just talking about genes. Just genes. And, you know, genetically modified organisms, you think that it's based in science, that we really know what we're injecting in there. This one here, these have epigenetic control. Epigenetic means that there's a control above the genes that's going to affect that gene expression. That gene expression, we're typically talking about protein production. Okay, does that make sense? Okay, so if we're talking about the protein production by a gene, we're talking either causing cancer or solving cancer. Okay, so it's that serious. All of these, heart disease, cancer, mental disorders, obesity, bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, sexual dysfunction. Consequences for modern medicine are profound, since it would imply our current understanding of pharmacology is an oversimplification. This means pharmaceutical products cause these illnesses and we don't know how. They do something with control of the genes. We haven't a clue. So if you're out there, you're part of a ready, fire, aim protocol, but luckily it's going to be ending really soon. It really will, because the neat part is people are waking up. I mean, if you want 84% of the people in Kansas, North Dakota, Colorado, New Mexico, and Texas, and that's a good hunk of the population, okay, just to not have any water, okay, well, right now they're having water, but it's poisonous water. And it can be stopped. We can extend it another 100-fold. Right now, today, we can stop it. So it's not like it's insurmountable. There's practices, not these high-yield crops. There's crops that can survive in an arid environment. They tried to introduce high-yield crops in North Africa, and they found out that the African farmers were saying, no, this doesn't make any sense. He says, why should I buy fertilizer and depend on more water than we have? We're going to use our crops that are adapted to this environment, and they're going to survive. So you know, thank goodness they're a lot smarter than American farmers. This one here, beyondpesticides.org, I encourage you to go to beyondpesticides.org, because when you look at this, you're going to see an entire sheet like this, and when you click on it, it's going to say the amount of pesticides used, what the pesticides are for, how it affects the farm workers. I know, we're not harvesting it, so we shouldn't care about them. Why not? I'm probably related to them. Okay, so let's care about them too. So you click on it and then you find out the other alternatives. So this is the key, beyondpesticides.org. Now, when you go to that site, they've got a lot of good information. Understand, allergies is the body's abnormal recognition of a protein. DNA and the genetically modified organisms are producing proteins. We're seeing a massive rise in allergies because we have genetically modified proteins in our diet that have never been there before. So when somebody comes in and they say, yeah, doc, I just had this allergy test, I say, well, it's worthless. Don't worry about it. You know, in a couple of weeks, it'll be different. So, you know, we're just going to change the amount of proteins that you're exposed to. You'll be fine. I mean, it's really that these type of studies, responsibletechnology.org, again, brilliant website. These are websites that are out there with the information, with the scientific data. Organ damage, gastrointestinal immune system disorders. This is all responsible for a lot of the ailments that we're experiencing, but there's no human experiment out there because, remember, the chemical company produced the seed in order to sell more chemicals, and it's working. They're making a lot of money, and they're the ones funding the government. So this change to save those states in the middle, to stop the desertification of the Ogallala Aquifer, to stop the next one. Because can you imagine this? Remember the clouds that blot out the sun? What if it picked up the dirt that's there now? You would aerate all the inorganic, the phosphates, the chemical fertilizers. You'd aerate all the glyphosates, okay? And this stuff is neurotoxic. I mean, if we had thousands and thousands of people dying from pneumonia when it was just dirt, can you imagine if that aerated, if you couldn't see your hand in front of your face in Washington, D.C. from that? I mean, it's not gonna work. So when people understand that we're doing the exact same practices that caused the Dust Bowl, okay, and we're not talking about it, this is something that absolutely has to change now. I mean, Europe has already gone a lot of the way to no GMO. That's why they have 1/10 the amount of pesticides in their urine and water supply. Because remember, the GMO, it's seeds produced by a chemical company to sell more chemicals. They're not helping with production or anything else. All of that other stuff was false science. David Suzuki, any scientists that tell you they know how GMOs are safe and not to worry about it, they're either ignorant of history of science or deliberately lying. Nobody knows what the long-term effects will be. That upper right thing, that's the only thing that you should be buying, organic, okay, or going to farmers markets or growing your own. You cannot grow it with pesticides because it's not in harmony with our environment. It's not going to work. This is actual food. I mean, it's good. This is what your body requires. I mean, you figure this here, I don't have any grandkids yet that I know of. Okay, but you got to know that everything we do, I mean, we've used this chart before. Everything that you do, you either go to optimal health or you go to death and disease. Every time, and we got to look at this. When we look at soil, soil is alive. It's got bacteria, it's got worms. I mean, if you've ever gardened before, you pick up that rich mulch and it's got that like sweet musky odor. I mean, it makes you just want to go like this. Well, maybe not. Okay, but you know, it's alive, and this is what the plants need. I mean, when I was first gardening before, you know, you'd grow one year and it was a good crop. You grow the next year and it was okay. Third year there wasn't anything growing. You think, wow, what did I mess up? Okay, it's the soil. You did the same thing. Okay, yeah. And so it's the same thing. Everything we do is going to help our planet and ourselves, or it's not. Okay, so if you go to those organizations around here called fast food that are supporting that genetically modified industry, we're wiping out a good hunk of our relatives in the middle of this country. Okay, we can't do that. Okay, aside from all the people around the world. I mean, Brazil's going through a hellacious amount of pesticide and toxins. I mean, this is a worldwide problem that we need to solve. Does that make sense? And we can. And luckily, it's time. We can actually extend the Ogallala Aquifer another 100-fold. Isn't that cool? And it's actually going to help the people and help the planet. So, thank you very much. And next week, Janine Stewart's going to be talking about food prep.